Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and I think stealing is based and you should do it on a regular basis. For legal purposes, I am talking about using thief units in Fire Emblem to acquire treasures for yourself. This video is going to be a history of thieves in Fire Emblem. Let's get to it. Thieves actually date back to the origins of the series, with Julian and Ricardo being the two thieves in Fire Emblem 1. It was an early attempt at a utility unit, and while it was able to do combat unlike curates, it wasn't particularly good at it. In fact, they didn't even bother giving Thief an animation for the Levin Sword, instead making it impossible for thieves to actually use the Levin Sword in-game, because they have 0% weapon level growth, and they have too low bases to reach Levin Sword's rank with the one manual. They would be one weapon level short if they used it. Between their abysmal weapon selections and their hilariously bad combat stats, it's clear that they were meant to steal, not to fight. The problem is that Kaga hadn't invented the steal command yet. Instead, Julian and Ricardo simply had exclusive use of an item referred to as the thief key or lockpick or master key, depending on your translation. It can open doors and chests, and that's it. That's all the unique utility they get. This could still potentially have been valuable because there are some good rewards in chests, and you don't have enough chest keys to open every single one of them. But unfortunately, Marth, with the Fire Emblem in his inventory, is actually able to open every chest in the game, aside from the first set of chests in Chapter 6. You just barely got a taste of the utility that these criminals can offer, and then Marth rolls up and says, I'm gonna invalidate your whole experience. Well, not their whole experience, because Marth can't open bridges or doors with the Fire Emblem, but you usually have enough door keys and bridge keys to handle the doors and bridges. Yes, bridge keys were a thing back in the Kaga era. They were always sort of around, and they kind of never really were relevant. Gaiden is a bad game, so there were no thieves in it, so we're moving straight on to Fire Emblem 3, and sadly things don't get any better for our dastardly boys. We once again get given the Fire Emblem after just one map of chests, so the thieves once again only have one map where they can pretend to be useful at all. Personally, I don't think either of these units are especially good, but adding extra insult to injury, Ricardo can only be recruited by Julian. This means that Ricardo is always going to be redundant on your team. His status is sort of meant to be a backup thief in case Julian dies, but if Julian dies, you can't recruit Ricardo. It's so tragic. Don't worry, buddy. At least you're good in Code of the Burger King. By the way, you should play Code of the Burger King. It's a really cool ROM hack, link below. That being said, talking about the Arcaneian thieves is depressing, so let's see how Kaga decided to iterate on the thief formula moving into Fire Emblem 4 Genealogy of the Holy War. Now, before we talk about the ways in which thieves were overhauled going into FE4, I do need to touch upon the economy in that game, because it is different than the rest of the series. In all other entries, your army has a shared gold value, and can use this to purchase weapons and items that anyone can use. As a result, units can trade items back and forth from each other relatively freely. If Kyle wants to use Ford's javelin, he can just steal it from Ford, punch Ford in his stupid face, and then chuck it at an enemy. In FE4, this is not the case. Each unit has their own individual gold and items, and units cannot trade items back and forth to each other. Instead, if you want to trade items back and forth, you need to go through the pawn shop. Let's say Sigurd has the Brave Sword, but you know that Arden is the better unit, and so you want to get it to him. Sigurd has to sell the Brave Sword to the pawn shop, and he gets some money from that sale, and then Arden can buy the Brave Sword and ascend to godhood. But he has to spend his own money. He can't spend the money that Sigurd got. Now, spouses can give gold to each other, but they can't trade items. So even if Sigurd and Arden got married, they would still have to go through the pawn shop, and Sigurd could give his gold to Arden that Arden could then use to buy the Brave Sword back. But in this scenario, you would still be losing money because you sell items at half value and buy them at full value. Unless you have the bargain ban, but that overcomplicates things. This system not only makes money management much more important, but also much more difficult, because you not only have to manage how much money you have, but who has that specific amount of money and what items they have. Thieves help alleviate this in two separate ways. The first is that they're able to give their money to anyone, not just people that they married. So, if Arden is 500 gold short of buying the Paragon Band, he can get that money from Dew in exchange for a smooch on the lips. The second is that thieves help bring more money into your army. Normally, there are only 3 ways that units can get gold. The first is visiting villages and getting gold as a reward. The second is fighting in the arena. The FE4 arena is different than what you might be used to, however, and you can only fight in it 7 times per chapter, each one giving you a fixed gold reward. The third way that units get money is based on their wages. At the start of each chapter, every unit in your army gets given 1,000 gold for every blue castle you had at the end of the prior chapter. Technically speaking, units can also get gold by selling items at the pawn shop, I guess, but that doesn't really add anything new into your economy, it just shuffles around who has it. Thieves, on the other hand, can take gold from outside of your player economy and add it into the system. And that's because every single enemy in FE4 has a gold value as well. And if you attack them with a thief and they land a hit, the thief will steal all of the gold that they have. If this enemy has 5,000 gold, congratulations, the thief now has that 5,000 gold. If that enemy has 5 million gold, congratulations, you hacked the game, because no unit can have more than 50,000 gold in their inventory. Thieves are clearly meant to be a utility unit. The intended play pattern is to attack enemies, steal their gold, and then give the gold to someone else. Rinse, lather, and repeat so that your actual combat units can always have a full stock of gold to repair their expensive weapons. Honestly, I really like this role for Thieves. Fire Emblem 4 is probably my favorite iteration of the Thief class in the series, but it is also when we start running into what will be a recurring problem for Thief design, and that is the question of how do Thieves grow and progress. You see, one aspect of the RPG half of SRPG is that units will not remain static throughout an entire playthrough. Instead, they grow, gaining new abilities and becoming better at fulfilling their role in the army. For combat units, this growth is fairly straightforward. If you gain more strength and defense, you are better at attacking and defending. If you gain more speed, you're faster. If you gain more resistance, you're not really all that much better. Resistance isn't very good. But with utility units like Thieves, it's a little bit more complicated. There's 2 basic ways that FE4 tried to make Thieves able to progress. The first one is just through leveling up like all other units. Anytime a thief hits 100 experience, they roll to see what stats go up, and if they reach level 20, then they can promote into the Thief Fighter class. No, I will not call it Rogue, the old translation was better. Personally, I don't think this method works very well. Because your thieves are not going to have very good combat bases, they will be slow to gain experience, only gaining a little bit through chip and 10 experience at a time anytime that they donate gold. In addition to this, the playable thieves do not have especially good growth rates, with Dew having around 40% in everything and Daisy having about 10% in everything. Patty is variable depending on what her parent is, but her normal growths are not all that good. However, even if you do get incredibly lucky and happen to proc your growths way more than average, they don't really help the thief units accomplish their main goal, which is stealing gold. All you need to do is land a single attack in order to steal all of the gold the enemy has. Sure, a little bit of extra bulk will help you survive counterattacks, and some more skill will help make sure that you definitely hit enemies, but also the enemies that have the most gold tend to be axe-wielding brigands, and they're weighed down by heavy weapons that are also pretty inaccurate. As a result, leveling up doesn't come fast and doesn't have much impact. And even if you do reach the coveted level 20, the Thief Fighter promotion doesn't actually give thieves really anything that they want. It instead focuses on combat, giving a good stat boost to strength and speed, as well as the pursuit skill to allow for doubling. This feels like it's going in the wrong direction. Instead of embracing the thief's unique utility role, it tries to pigeonhole them into a combat role which they are really not suited for. The other method I think is much more successful, and that is access to magical 1-2 range swords. Because every time thieves land an attack, they make a profit, it's not unreasonable for your thieves to use some of this gold to purchase one of the 4 magical swords available. Even if you don't want Evelyn to give up her light brand, the Chapter 3 Bolt Sword is not especially competitive. Normally, it's not a very good weapon because it's used by physical classes in order to deal magical damage. However, since Do doesn't care about how much damage he's dealing, he can just use it to attack from 2 range and steal money without facing retaliation. Additionally, players familiar with the game will be aware that there is a secret event in Chapter 3 where Do can get the Wind Sword for free. Much like the Thunder Sword, this is not a very good weapon, but Do just uses it to attack from 2 range and steal money. I often jokingly refer to the Wind Sword secret event as Do's true promotion, because it actually unlocks a new skill for him, which his legitimate promotion does not. Now, there are no secret event magical swords for the Thieves in Generation 2, but they can spend their money to purchase one, or in the case of Patty, she can inherit it from her father. Because they're both female, the Generation 2 Thieves have another trick up their sleeve, and that is the Miracle Sword. Now, it's not possible for Patty to inherit this because it can only be used by women, but she and Daisy can both purchase it with some of the gold that they steal. The Miracle Sword allows units to have an insane evasion boost for 1 turn if they get knocked down to 1 HP. Personally, I would prefer to have this on an actual combat unit, but if you don't have a female sword user trained up, then the Thieves don't make terrible use of it. As long as you can ensure they're able to take 1 hit, they can enemy phase and steal a bunch of gold from people, just dodging and whacking them. As far as the 3 individual Thieves are concerned, they don't really stand out from each other. You can only ever have 1 at a time, and since the Thief class doesn't really rely on its stats to do anything, they all kind of blend together. You could argue that the Gen 2 Thieves are better because there's more things to spend gold on in Gen 2, or you could argue the Gen 1 Thieves are better because it is harder to accomplish gold management in Gen 1, or you could give Do some extra credit for the weird story sequence where he uses his lockpick to unlock a drawbridge, but at the end of the day, the Thief is more of a class than a unit in genealogy. The sequel, Thracia 776, once again saw a major overhaul for the Thief class. Much like in Archanea, Thracian Thieves can unlock doors and chests with lockpicks. However, in addition to this, they have the ability to steal items from enemies. In order to do this, they must be faster than the enemy they wish to steal from, and the item they wish to steal must be lower than their constitution stat. But if both of these conditions are met, you can open a trade window and make a single item transfer between the 2 characters. And yes, this does mean that you can steal items onto enemies, which actually comes up for a couple of paralogs, weirdly enough. You see, Thracia has crit prevention items, and if you want to capture a boss instead of killing them, you can trade one of the crit prevention items onto the boss's inventory in order to make sure you don't accidentally get a low percentage crit and kill them when you're trying to chip them down. To anyone who hasn't played Thracia, this probably sounds like a meme, but it is a genuinely useful strategy and often recommended for unlocking some of the optional chapters in the game. However, that is not the only way in which stealing is useful. If an enemy is carrying a rare item, such as an S-Drink or a Physics Staff, you can have your Thief steal it, and there you go, it's yours now. And because Thracia's economy is incredibly tight, with the player not actually receiving any gold naturally, sometimes you can just steal vulneraries or elixirs in order to sell them to make some money. Now, while the Constitution requirement is a limiting factor that often prevents thieves from stealing weapons, there is no other mechanical clause that stops you from stealing equipped weapons. So, when it comes to mages who have tomes that are incredibly light, thieves can often steal their only weapon, effectively one-hit killing them. This, again, probably sounds like a meme, but it is frequently employed in the Manster arc in order to delete some scary fire mages. This benefits you both by eliminating an enemy that could attack you, and by getting another magical tome for Asvel, the early mage. Another notable lightweight weapon is the Rapier, which can be used by any sword unit in this game, so stealing them can also be very helpful to your army. Now, when asked the question of how thieves can progress throughout the game, Thracia had a slightly better answer. Because the speed stat is required for stealing, anytime you level up speed, you are getting better at thieving, and most of the thieves have a very good speed growth. Additionally, Thracia is one of only 2 games where you can actually level up the Constitution stat. It is a very low percent chance, but it is something that happens, and so thieves can be able to steal more items if they level up Con. And of course, a promotion gives a guaranteed speed and Constitution boost, meaning that even if you get unlucky, you can get better at stealing stuff just by getting 10 levels. That being said, Thracia is not perfect in this regard. Stealing still only gives 10 experience, which means that if all your thief is doing is stealing, it's going to be difficult for them to reach level 10. For two of the Thieves, this is less of a big deal because they're actually pretty competent at combat, but for the third thief, Laura, this is devastating. Unless you painstakingly grind stealing back and forth with Laura, she is unlikely to get the requisite experience to even get a couple of levels, let alone a promotion. And because her base constitution is pretty poor, she's not especially good at stealing things to begin with, meaning that Laura is kind of like an Arcanaean thief, just walking around opening doors and not really doing much else of value. In fact, this is so bad that many players will take all items out of her inventory and just let her get captured by enemies in order to weigh them down. Thankfully for her, Laura actually has a different way that she can progress. Through a secret event in Chapter 12X, Laura can promote not into Rogue, but into Dancer. She maintains the ability to steal and open doors, but gains the ability to refresh units' turns, giving them a second action. Dancing is one of the most powerful utility tools you can have in Fire Emblem, so this is quite nice. Overall, I think Thracia is actually the best game in the franchise when it comes to handling thief growth and progression. You get Lithis, who benefits from stat level ups and is actually able to do combat decent enough that he's probably going to level enough to promote, and if you do promote him, he gets better at stealing. You get Laura, who isn't really going to gain any experience, but that's okay because she gets better through a secret event rather than through leveling up. And then you get Parn, who is a pre-promote and isn't really meant to grow any more than he already is, but is perfectly competent at base for the rest of the game. The transition from Thracia to Binding Blade saw series creator Shozukaga leaving Intelligent Systems, and with his departure, the series got a good deal less experimental for a while. Perhaps for this reason, the iterations of Thieves in Fire Emblem 6 through 10 are all based loosely on how they manifested in Fire Emblem 5. They unlock doors and chests and steal items from enemies. In FE6, the mechanics behind stealing are simplified significantly from how they were in Thracia. You can no longer steal weapons or staves, only items, such as red gems or vulneraries. While it is disappointing not to get the dopamine rush of disarming mages, I think overall this change is probably for the best. Stealing weapons in Thracia was a big part of the economy because you were very tight on your money, whereas in FE6, if you're stealing for money, you're usually stealing sellable gems. The other change is one that I'm not a big fan of, and that is that stats no longer impact stealing whatsoever. As long as you are in the Thief class, you can steal from anyone. This means that the game's three thieves, Chad, Astolfo, and Kath, largely blend together. Astolfo is definitely the best of them because he has viable combat stats for a little bit, but if all you care about is stealing, then they are very interchangeable. Stealing is quite important in the Binding Blade. While you can buy door keys and chest keys in several shops if you don't feel like deploying a thief just to unlock stuff, the keys are more expensive than lockpicks. Additionally, the game contains several important items that can only be obtained by stealing them from enemies. The Delphi Shield in particular requires a thief to yoink it from a boss, but there's also some enemies that hold up gems that can help bolster your economy, or even a few extra promotion items in the late game. It's worth noting that FE6 is one of the few games where enemies do not ever drop items, which likely explains some amount of the dependence on stealing things. The biggest mechanical additions that Thieves have in GBA compared to Thracia is extra vision in Fog of War maps and a 100% chance to get desert items. Both of these attributes are nice to have, but I don't think either of them are necessarily worth deploying an entire unit for on their own. Oftentimes what ends up happening is you deploy a thief on a Fog of War map because you want to steal something, and you just benefit from the extra vision as a result. Now, in terms of the question of their progression, there really isn't any. Their stats don't impact thief utility, and thieves can't promote in Fire Emblem 6, so the only benefits from leveling up is additional combat. And while Astolfo does have better combat than both Chad and Kath, it's still nothing special, especially because without access to promotion, the thieves are stuck at unpromoted caps. In GBA, unpromoted units can't get any of their non-HP stats above a value of 20. As for the thieves themselves as units, like I alluded to earlier, they are pretty interchangeable. Chad joins in Chapter 3 and has a couple of maps to himself, Astolfo joins in Chapter 8, and Kath has a variable join time, but at the earliest she joins in Chapter 12. Since their stats don't really impact their ability to steal, the most crucial portion of their design is their join time, and I think their join times are kind of beautiful. All three of them join very close together, so as to give you multiple options for a thief if you are playing a no reset or Iron Man run. However, they are spread just far enough apart that you will miss out on a couple of treasures if you let the wrong one die. If Chad dies before Chapter 6, you do miss out on a couple of chests. If Astolfo and Chad both die before Chapter 12, then you're going to have a harder time getting the chest rooms in Chapter 12. Overall, I don't hate this approach for Thieves. It does kind of feel bad that they're static, but at the very least it doesn't incentivize you to use your Thieves in combat, since they're not especially good at it. Maps often have enough treasures and stealables to make Thieves feel useful without punishing you too harshly if one dies. But on the topic of being harshly punished for thief deaths, let's talk about Fire Emblem 7. I mentioned this in my FE7 tier list, but Matthew is in contention for the most important thief in the series. Before your second thief is able to join, Legault is able to get you a red gem, a second lockpick, a silver axe, a mend staff, a silver sword, your first hero crest, your first knight crest, an unlock staff, your first Elysian whip, your first guiding ring, the silver card, an eclipse tome, a dragon shield, and a talisman. What's more, this is a game where you cannot purchase guest keys. A couple of these items you can get if Matthew dies by having an enemy thief unlock the chest for you and then killing them in order to get the item, but quite a few of them need to be stolen off of enemy soldiers. Of particular note, the first Elysian whip and first guiding ring both need to be stolen on the pirate ship map, which is well after Matthew's join time. This makes Matthew feel like an incredibly important unit for the early game, and it is highly punishing to let him stay dead if he gets killed. But as soon as Legault shows up, Matthew is most likely going to be getting benched, and the reason for that is that in this game, your stats actually do impact your ability to steal. You need to have more speed than the enemy in order to steal items from them. You still can't steal weapons, and Constitution still isn't a factor, but your speed stat is relevant for who you can steal from. And unless Matthew has been trained to an absurd extent, Legault is always going to have more speed than him at the time that he joins. You end up with this little thief shuffle, where you start using one for a little bit, and then they get outshined by the next one, so you move over to the next thief. While in theory, needing speed to steal items feels like a good thing, as it rewards you for training your thieves, in practice it can be a little bit frustrating. Of the items that I named, some of them do require Matthew to get speed in order to steal them. In particular, the silver card will always require Matthew to get at least 1 point of speed, although some of the other stealables will depend on the enemy's random stats, whether Matthew can steal them or not. I assume that the devs were trying to reward you for training your thief by making them more able to steal things the more you trained them. However, there is not much experience to be gained from doing utility thief stuff. You don't get anything from opening doors and chests, and you only get 10 experience per item stolen. This means that for Matthew to hit speed benchmarks, he's going to have to do some combat and gain experience that way. So you end up with this weird push-pull of a utility unit being encouraged to do combat rather than stick to his utility role. And this continues when talking about Thief promotion, which is handled probably the worst that any promotion in the franchise has been handled. If using a fell contract, Thieves can promote into Assassins. Much like with Thief Fighter in Fire Emblem 4, the promotion focuses on combat instead of utility, giving 0 points of speed so it doesn't even add to your ability to steal. But actually, it takes away from your ability to steal. Moreover, it takes away your ability to steal. Assassins cannot steal items anymore. They can still use lockpicks in order to open doors and chests, but they cannot steal items. So they lose half of the thief utility that they already had. In exchange for this, they gain +1 strength, +2 defense, +2 resistance, and +3 HP. Truly abysmal promotion gains. Now, Assassins do get the skill Lethality, which means if they land a critical hit, there is a 50% chance that they kill the opponent. Although against bosses, this is reduced to 25% instead of 50%. I could dunk on this as being an unreliable gimmick, but instead I think it's worth pointing out that Lethality actually has impact, which it wouldn't for really any actual combat class. Any combat unit landing a critical hit is going to be killing anyway, but if assassins land a critical hit, then they're probably not doing enough damage to kill without a lethality proc. And that to me is more damning than if lethality were superfluous. Now, all of this on its own is pretty bad, but the worst thing is that Thieves can't even promote until extremely late in the game. They need to use the unique item Fell Contract, which is only available from killing the boss of Night of Farewells. At this point in the game, there are a maximum of 6 chapters remaining in the campaign, one of which is optional, and one of which only has 1 deployment slot in addition to your lore. So there's not even that much time to make use of your shiny new assassin. But lethality is an interesting gimmick, so you could potentially want to use them just for the uniqueness aspect. Except for the fact that the chapter before you're able to get the Fell Contract, Jafar joins, and Jafar is an assassin with far superior stats to either Matthew or Legault. It's honestly kind of ridiculous. I understand that people were upset that Thieves could not promote in Fire Emblem 6, but promoting in Fire Emblem 7 feels like a downgrade for our Thieves. Between that and the over-reliance on Matthew for important early game items, I feel like Thieves were handled pretty poorly in Fire Emblem 7. Thankfully, Fire Emblem 8 attempted to fix this. Whether it was successful or not is up for debate. Sacred Stones added branching promotions, meaning that anytime a unit promoted, it could choose between 2 different classes. For the Thief class, they could go Assassin if they wished to focus on combat, or Rogue if they wished to focus on utility. Rogues maintain the ability to steal and gain a new skill, where they can open doors and chests without using a lockpick. While it's definitely nice for Thieves to have a promotion option that doesn't take away from their utility, ultimately, Colm, the only unpromoted thief in the game, does not gain much from promoting. Chest keys are buyable in this game, and you've got enough lockpick uses and droppable door keys to open basically any door that you care about. Granted, not having to hold a lockpick in your inventory does make stealing a little bit easier. However, I would have appreciated if Rogue gained some speed on promotion, since that is the only stat that Thieves care about from a utility perspective. And yet, once again, the Thief promotion gains no speed. And on the topic of not getting enough speed, Colm is your only thief for 2/3 of the game, and his starting speed stat of 10 is pretty abysmal. He has enough speed to steal a couple of things in the early game, but if you want him to continue into the mid game, you are going to have to level him up. And since unlocking still gives 0 experience, and stealing still only gives 10, he is going to have to do combat. As part of the 4th strength crew, Colm's combat is pretty abysmal. Thankfully, you can kind of just decide to neglect Colm because none of the mid-game stealables are actually all that impactful. In fact, they're so unimpactful that I quite literally cannot remember what the mid-game stealables are. Renak, the pre-promoted rogue, shows up in chapter 14, and he can be your thief for the rest of the game. He has the speed necessary to steal whatever you need in the late game, and he can open doors and chests without using lockpicks. In many ways, Thieves feel like an afterthought in Sacred Stones. While their promotion was theoretically improved and their promotion item was moved to much earlier in the game than Fire Emblem 7, things like buyable chest keys and a lack of high-value stealables really make Thieves feel redundant. I'd much rather just deploy combat units or healers. Overall, I think Fire Emblem 6 has the best showing for GBA Thieves, between their deployment time as well as their ability to just sort of sub in for each other, but it does cause them to kind of blend together. While I can respect what Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones were going for with the speed stat and promotion, I think that promoting Thieves should give some speed, since that is the primary stat that Thieves care about. Additionally, I think that Thieves should be able to gain much more experience from their utility role than they currently can. Stealing only granting a flat 10 feels insulting. I think that they should gain more experience based on the value of the item stolen, kind of like how healers gain more experience from using higher ranked stabs. I also think that opening doors and chests should give some experience to Thieves. In this manner, they're able to gain experience through their primary role, the utility role, rather than through combat, which is something that they really aren't meant to be doing. But of course, that's not what Intelligent Systems ended up doing, and Tellius' iteration of Thieves is even more uneven than GBA's. In Fire Emblem 9, Path of Radiance, Thieves are very similar to the Thracia variant, once again gaining the ability to steal weapons. They need to have a higher speed than the person they're stealing from, and they need to have a higher strength stat than the weight of the weapon. However, one additional restriction was placed on the Path of Radiance Thieves, and that is the inability to steal equipped weapons and items. On the surface, this seems small, but in practice, it often means that they can't steal any weapons at all, as most enemies only have one weapon in their inventory, and it will always be equipped. Occasionally, there will be some bosses who have more than one weapon. Most notably, in Blood Runs Red, you can steal a Legus Slayer. But for the most part, this edition just means you can steal Heal, Mend, and Physics staves, since staffers do not equip their staves, at least for now. Additionally, there is a weird lack of stealable items on enemies. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a single stealable item that isn't dropped. As a result of this, the biggest reason for deploying Thieves is just because there's chests on the map and you want someone to unlock them. After all, Path of Radiance does not have any buyable chest keys, but it does have a large number of droppable chest keys, and it also has a large number of chests that don't have anything of particular value in them. I have routed out a Path of Radiance playthrough that gets every valuable chest without ever using a thief, relying only on chest keys and skipping out on chests like the Miracle Scroll or the Stiletto. Oh, on the topic of the Stiletto, I guess I should talk about the additional nerf to combat that Thieves got. Now, in addition to giving Thieves bad combat stats, they also give them the unique weapon type Knives, which are basically just lower might variants of swords that cannot be forged. There's only 3 of them, the Knife, Dagger, and Stiletto, and in Path of Radiance they have no special effects. This change means that even if you get stat blessed on either of the 2 Thieves, they really can't do anything combat-wise. They're just too held back by their weapon type. And speaking of the 2 Thieves, let's take a look at them as units. Volk joins first, and he charges you 50 gold per door or chest that he unlocks. It's worth noting that the lockpick item does not exist, and instead Thieves just have the lock touch skill, so this 50 gold is kind of equivalent to a lockpick use. Volk's stats are passable but nothing special, and Knives hold him back from doing really good combat. Notably, both his strength and speed need to be leveled up so that he can continue to steal weapons. And, say it with me, stealing does not give enough experience and unlocking doesn't give any, so he's going to have to do combat with his subpar stats and weapons. And this isn't even a mid-game thing. The Legus Slayer that I mentioned, which is the first real stealable item, he needs to proc strength for. Of course, there is another solution if you don't want to drag Volk through combat, and that is bonus experience. In Path of Radiance, completing certain objectives gives you experience you can just apply to any unit you want. If you desperately want to level up Volk's stats and don't want to drag him through the trenches, then this is a way to do that. Realistically though, I think he's mostly going to be stealing physics staffs and unlocking stuff for you. His competition is Soth, who joins after him with worse stats, but does not charge you 50 gold per unlock. Soth also has the skill Blossom, which cuts his experience gain in half, but allows him to reroll stats a couple of times when leveling up. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but to oversimplify it, he does sometimes gain more stats as a count of Blossom. None of this really matters though, because he's a growth unit who gets half experience gain. Things were bad enough when Volk was trying to do combat. Soth is just not able to fight whatsoever. And the ultimate joke is that if you do decide to invest in Soth because he's the growth unit, you still get a worse unit long term, because Volk is able to promote into Assassin via a story event, whereas Soth is stuck as a thief. Assassins can steal in Path of Radiance, unlike the GBA games, so at least Intelligent Systems is learning something about how to design thief promotions. That being said, the promotion still doesn't fix Volk's combat. Lethality is funny, but you actually have to spend a resource to assign it to him. The Occult Scroll gives mastery skills to people, and you do have to spend one in order to get lethality on Assassin. I'll be honest, a big part of why I wanted to make this video is I think the Thieves in Path of Radiance are pretty overhyped. Stealing weapons seems really cool until you realize that most of the time there are not weapons you can steal. When you can steal them, it's often just steal variants, and this is in a game where you get practically infinite money. Stealing fire tomes in Thracia was valuable not only because it deleted the mages, but because you had no money, and so that was how you got weapons. In Path of Radiance, you have so much money that it is almost impossible to spend it all. Like, I made max level silver forges every chapter and still had way more gold than I knew what to do with. When combined with the lack of stealable items and the additional nerf to thief combat, it just does not feel like there's a huge place for thieves. That being said, if you really want to copium on thieves, they can steal physics staves, and there's quite a few of them to steal. You get 2 naturally, which I find to be more than enough for a game like Path of Radiance, but if you really want to go hard with your staffers, then using thieves to steal more physics staves is incredibly fun if nothing else. So of course, when we entered Radiant Dawn, they decided to take away our fun. The Thief class actually works the exact same way in Radiant Dawn as it does in Path of Radiance. The change was made to staff classes. Now priests, sages, bishops, and all those staff-wielding classes equip staves after they use them. This means that if there is a priest on the map that has a physics staff, you can no longer steal it. Honestly, this feels pretty stupid to me. Still, in the transition from Path of Radiance to Radiant Dawn, the Thief class got a number of buffs that I personally think more than make up for the equipped staff problem. The first is the addition of the Disarm skill. This is a proc skill that causes the enemy to unequip their weapon. And of course, the way that you get it is it starts out on Braum, our Lord and Savior. This is the year of Braum 2024. The idea behind Disarm is you give the skill to someone who is very weak, have them attack an enemy who has a valuable weapon equipped. If they proc Disarm and don't kill the enemy, then you can have your thief run over and steal it. This is obviously a bit of a meme, but the next buff really isn't. And that is the fact that now enemies are actually holding meaningful rewards for you to steal. There are multiple skill scrolls, there are some gems, and the economy actually matters now, and there are stat boosters. This on its own really helps with the utility role of thieves. However, their combat has also been significantly buffed. Knives are much better now. There are high crit variants, 1-2 range variants, and you can forge knives. Heck, you can forge 1-2 range knives before you can forge any other 1-2 range weapon. And when I say before, I mean like dozens of chapters before. It's for this very reason that one of the Jagans of Radiant Dawn is a thief unit. Well, technically the class is called Rogue, but it is equivalent to the thief class in Radiant Dawn. As the Dawn Brigade's Jagan, Soth's combat is excellent throughout most of Part 1. With a base strength of 18 and a base speed of 20, he's going to double almost everyone and one round most people that he doubles, especially when you can supplement his already good strength by forging 1-2 range knives for him. His growths are also quite good, with a 60% strength growth and a 45% speed growth. It's just that he doesn't gain experience that fast because he's a tier 2 unit fighting mostly tier 1 units. I often hear people talk about Soth as the nearly perfect Jagan, because he starts out with really good combat and then he can slide into a utility role as a thief. However, I kind of want to push back against that. While I agree with the first half that his combat is incredibly good and it falls off after you leave Part 1, I disagree with the fact that he can be a utility unit in Parts 3 and Part 4. There are not really any jobs for thieves to do in the Dawn Brigade's Part 3 chapters. There's no stealables in any of them, and while there are hidden items in some of the maps, the hidden items are usually not particularly valuable, things like olivey grass, and even if we're just talking about the valuable items like the Brave Bow and the Laguz gem, those are not guaranteed to be gotten by thieves. For the first and, as far as I'm aware, only time since the mechanic was introduced, thieves no longer have a 100% get chance for hidden items. Instead, they just have a slightly higher chance than other units. I think it's 1 in 11, but I'm not 100% certain, and sources are conflicting in terms of their information. Regardless, there's just not much stealing for Soth to do after his combat falls off. Ironically, there is a lot of thief utility in part 1, which is when his combat is very good. His utility roll and combat roll both fall off around the same time. It's really weird and very sad. I do wish that there was more stealing for him to do in parts 3 and part 4, because then it would be a really cool design for Combat God going into utility role, but as it stands, he just kind of falls off hard after part 1 and is a huge burden for the rest of the game. Adding insult to injury, his promotion to tier 3 is held off for story reasons until after 4-P. He only has 6 maps to make use of his final tier. Heather, on the other hand, is entirely designed to be a utility unit. Her combat stats just are not good enough for the point in the game where she joins. But there's plenty of stealables in part 2 and part 3 that she can yoink for you. Between the energy drop in 2-E, the statue frag in 3-2, and all of the Senator's items in 3-3, Heather is going to be getting a lot of things for you. And that's before factoring in any disarm memes. Remember, Braum has disarm and Braum says gay rights. Now, her strength will stop her from stealing heavier weapons unless you have used bonus experience, but if you're using disarm, you're already memeing. You might as well meme hard. In contrast to Soth, Heather is able to promote like a normal unit, either by hitting level 21 or by using a Master Crown after she hits level 10. Regardless of their different promotion paths, both of these rogues end up promoting to Whisper, which is a noticeable downgrade from the Assassin class that Volk joins in. You see, in Radiant Dawn, all tier 3 classes get a special proc skill. Most of these proc skills will just kill whatever enemies they proc on. For example, Luna pierces the enemy's defense and triples your damage. Flare does the same thing for resistance, Soul triples your damage and heals your HP, there's a bunch of them and they're all just instant kill buttons. But the Whisper class gets Bane, and Bane leaves the enemy on 1 HP. Now there are some misconceptions around this. Bane cannot stop you from killing an enemy who you would have killed without proccing Bane. But if you're attacking an enemy who you wouldn't have killed and you proc Bane, you don't kill them. Whereas if you're attacking an enemy you wouldn't have killed and you proc any other mastery skill, you do kill them. And that includes the Assassin class's mastery skill, which is just lethality. It's just an instant kill, which all of the other ones are also instant kills. They're just fancier instant kills. I'm sorry, if you triple damage and half the opponent's defense, you're killing them anyway. Anyway, despite joining as an assassin, which technically doesn't promote from rogue, I'm going to talk about Volk here because he very much is supposed to be a thief. And he's not very good. I mean, he is good, his stats are very good, but he joins super late. He joins in literally the last map before you go into the tower. The tower is a 5-part endgame for Radiant Dawn, where you pick your 10 best units and go through a gauntlet of maps that are supposed to be the most challenging, but in many cases are just really easy to trivialize. That being said, Volk doesn't really help you in any of them. There is a single chest to unlock, which would incentivize you to bring a thief, were it not for the fact that Soth comes automatically for free. While Soth's combat is definitely worse than Volk's, Volk's combat is worse than most of your combat units, which means that Soth is probably going to be opening that chest, even if he's not going to be opening anyone's throats. There's not that much more to say about Volk. He's just a unit who might as well not exist in the game. And the devs seem to think so as well, because they actually forgot to program in the message for when you try to open a chest with him and don't have the money for it. You see, Volk will still charge 50 gold to open chests in Radiant Dawn, just like he did in Path of Radiance. If you have no gold and try to open a chest in Path of Radiance, a message comes up that says you need 50 gold, or something along those lines. But if you try to open a chest when you have no gold in Radiant Dawn, a message comes up that just says dummy. Now, while the real reason for this is that they just didn't program in a message, and so the dummy text is there, I like to believe that Volk is calling you an idiot for trying to get him to open the chest. And I think that's very funny. What's not funny, however, is the treatment of the Arcanean Thieves when we go to Remake Land. Up next, we return to Arcanea, and the Thieves are relatively unchanged, but somehow that ends up nerfing them because the mechanics in FE11 and FE12 are different from FE1 and FE3. Specifically, they introduce infinite reclassing, and only Marth, Julian, and Ricardo are unable to reclass. Additionally, unlike in early Fire Emblem, in DSFE, swords are not the best weapon type. Arguably, lances are the best weapon type in DSFE since you have access to the Horse Slayer. Regardless, they're stuck with a bad weapon type and stuck in a bad class, so you can't make up for their lack of thief utility by reclassing them into a combat unit. And their thief utility is still pretty bad. Just like in early Arcanea, Marth gets the Fire Emblem and can open all of the chests, so all that Thieves could open for you that Marth can't is doors. And hey, you can get door keys in FE11 and FE12, so what's the point? I honestly don't have too much else to say about Thieves in this era, so let's just move on to Awakening. Awakening is the beginning of what I would consider to be modern Fire Emblem, which is an era where I believe there is a design philosophy of no bad units. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of this philosophy because I'm a big fan of bad units, but the way in which this affected Thieves is suddenly they could no longer simply be utility units. As such, Gaius and Anna, the two units that start in the Thief class line, are both meant to be used in combat. While the Thief class does get Lock Touch as a skill, that isn't really the appeal of going into it. Instead, it is the movement +1 you get at level 10, and the option to promote into either Assassin or Trickster. This ends up making Thief just feel like a Myrmidon variant. They even have some promotions in common. Myrmidon can promote to either Swordmaster or Assassin, and Thief can promote to either Assassin or Trickster. Trickster being a new class that uses swords and staves, whereas Assassin, in Awakening exclusively, uses swords and bows. As far as the Thief progression problem is, that no longer really exists. In all games going forward, Thieves are treated just like regular combat units, and so as a result, their form of progression is just their combat improving. As for the Thieves themselves, we have Anna and Gaius. I'll start with Anna because that is a more fun unit to talk about. She is one of the strongest units in the game, on account of being one of the few pre-promotes. However, I wouldn't say that her base class of Trickster is a reason for Anna being good, and in fact, my advice would be to reclass her to Sage as soon as you are able. Anna just has incredibly good stats for the time, in particular her magic. You can give her 11 sword once you beat Gangrel, and if you have renown bonuses, there's another 11 sword available from those. But otherwise, she's going to be attacking with her mediocre strength until you're able to class her into a tome-using class. The biggest benefits that she gets from Trickster is having Thief skills for free. +1 movement is a boon to anyone, but most people don't want to spend 10 levels in the Thief class because it's a pretty bad class to be in. The fact that Anna starts out as a Trickster means that she starts out with both it and Lock Touch. Lock Touch isn't anything special, but it is nice to have, and there are several maps where you're going to want to equip someone with Lock Touch just so you can get all the treasure chests. Since Anna is a very good unit and someone you're probably using anyway, Lock Touch is kind of just nice to have on her for free. In comparison, Gaius is pretty bad. I know he's popular and no one is truly unusable in Awakening, but I do think he's bottom tier. And most of that is just because he has a really bad starting class. Thief is just not a good place to be. They really cut down on the utility that the class offers, but also didn't make its combat up to snuff to make it a viable combat class. Lock Touch is nice, just like it is on Anna, but it's not really worth deploying him on his own. And extra insult to injury, Gaius only joins one map that has chests prior to you getting Anna, and it is his join map, and the only chest on that map has a secret book. Stat boosters are always nice, although skill is definitely a lower tier stat. I guess the other utility that Gaius can offer is pair-up bonuses. Thief is the only unpromoted class that gives +1 movement on pair-up, which is pretty valuable. It also gives 2 points of skill and 2 points of speed, so if all you want is a pair-up bot, you can definitely do worse. Granted, most promoted mounted classes also give movement, so once you get to the point where people are promoting, it's no longer as big a deal, and personally, I wouldn't deploy Gaius just for the +1 move on pair-up, but it is something that he can offer, and it's kind of the most that he can offer. I mean, like, yes, you can hyper-train him like you can hyper-train anyone, and you can make him into a competent unit, but you really have to reclass him out of Thief for that to be possible. Speaking of reclassing, several units can reclass into Thief, but none of them really want to. Off the top of my head, Kellum, Henry, and Pan can all go Thief, and there's probably at least one more that I'm forgetting, but Thief is not a desirable class, and so if you spend a second seal to go into Thief, it feels really bad. Overall, Awakening just isn't a good game to be Thief in. They got rid of most of the utility, but didn't buff its combat enough to make it a standout class. On the other hand, the Fates equivalents of Thieves are both pretty good. While Fates does not have a class named Thief, it does have both a Hoshidan and Norian class with access to Lock Touch, and I would consider these to be that game's equivalent to the Thief class. On the Norian side of things, we have the Outlaw class, which is basically what if Thief but bows. But honestly, despite their status as a meme weapon, bows are really good in a lot of Fire Emblem games, and Fire Emblem Fates is no exception. Bows are tied with axes for having the highest might of all weapons, while also having more hit than axes do. The trade-off of being locked to 2 range also is less of a big deal, considering how much Fates has nerfed 1-2 range weapons, meaning that if you want to attack from 2 range, bows are one of your better options. And considering how threatening enemies can be in Fates, being able to attack from 2 range is definitely a good thing. That being said, Outlaw as a class kind of just acts like Discount Archer, having slightly worse stats and noticeably worse skills. Having to trade a real skill for Lock Touch is never going to be great, but considering the Archer class gets Quick Draw, one of the better player-face skills in the game, it feels extra insulting in the case of Outlaw. That being said, seemingly in an effort to buff Lock Touch, they changed how door keys and chest keys work. Now, keys cannot stay in your convoy for more than 1 chapter. If a key is dropped in Chapter 5 and you move on to Chapter 6 without using it, the key disappears. Therefore, unlike in Path of Radiance, where you could just hoard chest keys from earlier maps in order to get later treasure, now you can't really do that. If there's not enough chest keys for the treasure on the map, then you do need to use someone who has access to Lock Touch. I guess in theory this is more realistic as well. After all, a key from the Chapter 1 fortress really shouldn't work in the Chapter 17 fortress, but Fire Emblem isn't really a series known for realism, so that probably wasn't the motivation behind this change. Despite this, Lock Touch is still pretty disappointing to get, especially because, much like in Awakening, the Thief classes are pushed more towards combat. Outlaw might just be knockoff Archer, but Archer's a good class, and so if you're a knockoff of a good class, you're still pretty okay. And the way that it progresses is by leveling up its combat stats, as you can expect. Upon promotions, Outlaws can either become Bow Knights or Adventurers. Bow Knight is a very good combat class, with mounted movement, solid stats, and even good pair-up bonuses if you want to turn someone into a backpack. Adventurer, on the other hand, is kind of trying to be a utility class and also a hybrid class. It's an infantry class that uses both staves and bows, and has a decent amount of both strength and magic. I guess the idea is to lean into the utility role for Thieves, since you can have staff utility and Lock Touch on a single unit, plus they gain access to the pass skill, but overall it kind of just feels like a class that doesn't really know what its identity wants to be. The biggest niche that it has is potentially using the Shining Bow, since that is a magical 1-2 range bow with very high might, but the poster child for that strategy, Nyx, is not exactly the most competent unit in the game in either of the routes she's available. But speaking of units, I'm going to focus on Niles and Nina because those are the only 2 units who start in the Outlaw class. While others can access it either through marriage, parentage, or using second seals, I think that I would be here all day just talking about Fates, and I'd rather talk about the entire franchise. Niles has pretty decent combat stats. He doesn't stand out as a god amongst men, but both his bases and growths are serviceable, and as I said before, Bow Knight is a very good class. However, the most notable thing about him is his personal skill, Capture, which can allow him to capture some generics to recruit into your army, as well as some of the chapter bosses. Capture is in a really weird place, because on the one hand, it's incredibly powerful, letting you restock your army with an infinite supply of meat bags, as well as granting you access to some otherwise hard to achieve skill combinations, such as tons of rallies on Rallyman, pass on Falco Knight, or just generics with high weapon ranks. Additionally, several of the capturable bosses from Paralogs have absolutely nutso stats, especially if you're willing to delay them to allow them to auto-level towards the endgame. On the other hand, due to their inability to build supports and their much more limited access to reclassing, generics are noticeably less powerful than player characters. As such, capturing often comes off as a gimmick. It undeniably has its use cases, but oftentimes those use cases can be replicated with proper planning. Honestly, capture makes Niles really annoying to evaluate, so instead let's talk about what if he didn't have capture and had slightly more combat utility. Oh, that's just Nina! With a physical mother, Nina will have slightly better combat than her father as a bow knight, but there is also the option to give her a magical mother if you want to do some shining bow shenanigans. Ultimately, both of these builds are kind of just generically good, but they are also very low investment. One other notable thing about Nina is if you delay her paralog long enough, she can get past for free by using an offspring seal into Adventurer. Since most units don't want to stay in Adventurer for a long time, using the offspring seals to skip this mess is definitely useful, and it's probably the easiest way to get past outside of capturing one of the past Falco Knights in Lunatic mode. During editing, I realized I forgot to talk about Shura, who also starts in the Outlaw class. I could talk about his incredibly high stats and how they stand out as well as his really good class set, but instead I'm just gonna make a joke about how this video recruited the boots instead. But enough talking about Outlaws, because the real juice is on the Hoshiden side of things, with the Ninja class. Arguably one of the best physical classes in the game. When talking about the strength of bows, I mentioned that Fates has some of the weakest 1-2 range in the series. However, that wasn't entirely true. While javelins, hand axes, and the throwing katanas are definitely nerfed, hidden weapons, aka knives and shurikens, are incredibly strong. They're lower might than other physical weapons, but they have inherent 1-2 range, and, as a kicker, they also debuff enemies after combat. Outside of the DLC, these weapons are exclusive to Ninja, its promotions Mechanist and Master Ninja, as well as Maid/Butler, which is essentially the same class but gender flipped. This on its own is incredibly strong, but Ninja gets even more favoritism. If you choose to go Mechanist, they get mounted movement and access to bows in addition to their hidden weapons. The skills in Mechanist are pretty weak, but Replicate at level 15 can let you do some funny meme stuff. On the other end of things, if you go Master Ninja, you get sword access, which is less useful than bows, but still nice to have, I guess. However, despite having access to 2 weapon types, Master Ninja is treated the same way that classes that only have 1 weapon are. That being, it has an inherent +5 bonus to hit, crit, avoid, and dodge, as well as the ability to use an S-rank weapon, specifically the S-rank shuriken. All of the other classes capable of using S-ranks can only use 1 weapon type, such as Berserker and Spearmaster. The exception, of course, being that the S-rank staff can be used by maids and butlers, which just goes to show that all of the hidden weapon classes get super favoritism. And their stat lines aren't too shabby either. Master Ninja gets a lot more speed in exchange for a little bit less strength and defense, but overall they're great classes to be in no matter what you're looking for. And much like with Outlaw, I'm going to focus only on the units who start in Ninja, which is a huge relief because most of the Hoshiden cast can access Ninja fairly easily. Kaze is first, and his big selling point is that he's available on Conquest, making him one of the easiest ninjas to get there. While Laszlo can second seal and you can do friendship and marriage stuff to pass Ninja on to other people, Kaze is the only one there for free, and he starts out with a decent shuriken rank. When moving on to the Birthright and Revelations campaigns, Kaze has to compete with more ninjas, and there his selling point is just that he joins earlier. Being able to gain some levels before the Branch of Fate, as well as in the early portions of the campaigns, is definitely nice, and it puts him ahead of curve. But he doesn't hold up long term compared to his brother. Partially because the stat that he has chosen to invest most heavily in is Resistance, which is less of a meme stat in Fates than in other games, but it still isn't as useful as Strength, Defense, Speed, all the good stats, you know? Speaking of good stats, let's talk about Saizo. Saizo starts out in arguably the best class in the game, and he has some of the best personal growths, with a personal strength of 50%, personal speed of 30%, and a personal defense of 45%. 30% speed is not great, but given the fact that he starts in Ninja, a class that gives you a huge speed growth, it's honestly good enough. In Ninja, his growths are 55% strength, 50% speed, and 50% defense. In Birthright, he's definitely a top 3 unit, and one of the easiest carries you can have. His Achilles heel is a terrible res growth, but if you're only going to have one stat as your dump stat, res is probably the best candidate. He does also have -2 to his speed cap, which can be annoying in the endgame, but honestly, I think his stats are good enough. Interestingly, Saizo even has a decent magic growth at 45%. I wouldn't recommend reclassing him to a magical class, but it does mean that he can wield a flame shuriken against high defense enemies in order to pierce their defenses. Alternatively, you could just give him a magical wife in order to focus on a magical ninja in his son, although that's probably not the best use of Asuji. While I dunked on Gaius as being one of the worst units in Awakening, I think his Hoshiden counterpart is pretty solid. As a second generation unit, his growths are going to be pretty variable depending on who his mom is, but he'll always turn out pretty solid. Personally, I think the best route is to give him a physical mom just to make him a replicate of his father. After all, his father's a pretty good unit. But if you want to be spicy, a magical mom can make him a magical flame shuriken focused ninja. Other than that, he's very similar to his father. He's slightly faster and got a little bit less strength, but overall they are very comparable units. General all-arounders in a very good class that will be very good hard carries if you want them to, with relatively little investment required. The last ninja we have to talk about is Kagero, and yes, she is the last. Even though Yukimura is a mechanist, he evolved from merchant, not from ninja, so I'm not going to talk about him, which is good because I don't really know anything about him. Kagero is basically if you took the stat line of a berserker and put it into ninja. She has a very high strength growth and a very high speed growth and not much else to say for it. On the one hand, this is nice because high strength and high speed means you can one-round basically anyone you put your mind to. On the other hand, her lackluster defenses limit her ability to enemy phase, which takes away from one of the big strengths of hidden weapons. In Birthright, this is especially painful considering just how route heavy that game is. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't call Kagero a bad unit. She's not getting one-rounded by every enemy, and you can make up with her bulk a little bit using guard gauge and pair-up bonuses and whatnot, but at the end of the day, I would rather be an all-arounder like Saizo than be Kagero. Overall, I would say this is the strongest showing for Thief classes, although personally, I am a little bit disappointed in their transition from utility to combat role. While their performance is definitely better, it feels like a bit of a flavor fail. Speaking of flavor fails, in Three Houses, the church actually teaches people how to become brigands and thieves. It definitely feels counter to the game's lore, but personally, I get a chuckle out of it every time someone fails the brigand exam. I like to imagine the multiple choice is smash, big smash, more smash! But we're not here to talk about brigands, because thieves actually do exist in Three Houses' convoluted class tree, although they're not super useful. The class inherently has lock touch, but considering door and chest keys are buyable on the preparations menu, all that really does is save you an inventory slot. The real appeal of going into Thief is the ability to steal items, although I'll be honest, there aren't a huge number of good stealables in the game. Battle of Eagle and Lion has a couple of accuracy and evasion rings on the opposite house leaders, and during part 2 there's the opportunity to steal anti-effectiveness equipment, but otherwise I struggle to think of good stealables. Thankfully, Thief certification isn't actually that difficult. It overlaps with Myrmidon, requiring only C-rank swords, or D if you're willing to gamble. And just for the few of you who are about to comment, actually you mean Mercenary not Myrmidon, I swapped them on purpose to demonstrate the point of Three Houses class system being way too convoluted and confusing. I guarantee you at least 75% of my viewers didn't notice. Anyway, here's a fun fact about Thief that you probably don't know. In Three Houses, you can actually steal items onto the enemy, much like in Thracia. However, unlike in Thracia, there aren't any situations I can think of where this would be useful. I guess theoretically you could steal a non-weapon hero's relic onto someone so they take 10 damage after every combat, but like, that feels really niche and also not good and also a waste of a hero's relic, and also I haven't even tested to see if you can steal hero's relics onto them. I feel like the game would safeguard against it. Regardless, I don't have much more to say about Thieves in Three Houses, so let's move on to the most recent Fire Emblem game, Engage. The Thief class once again appears in Engage, but it's in a really weird and frustrating place. Honestly, it feels half-baked. Technically speaking, the Thief class can pick locks in order to open doors, but you can also just destroy doors by attacking them. Doors are also incredibly rare. There's one map that has them before you have Thieves, and to my knowledge, only 3 afterwards. Technically speaking, thieves can also open chests, but this is no longer a unique attribute of theirs. Literally any unit can open a chest. No keys required. So instead, Thief is basically just a combat class. They use knives, which does poison enemies, which I guess you could look at as utility, but it's not a very useful one. Knives are fairly decent weapons. They're 1-2 range, and you can pretty cheaply forge them to increase their might. However, the Thief class itself is weird. Rather than being either unpromoted or promoted, Thieves are a special class, meaning that they level all the way from 1 to 40. Gaining their promoted class skill at 25. In other games this wouldn't be as much of a downside, but because of the way the experience formula works in Engage, you actually want to promote as soon as possible. You see, in most games, promoted units get an experience penalty, so if you early promote, you're trading the stat gain from promoting for less experience and less stats in the long term. However, in Engage, a unit's experience is determined by their internal level, which is just how many times they've leveled up. It doesn't factor in promotion at all. As a result, you want to promote as soon as you're able to, both to get stat buffs from going into a promoted class, to get better growth rates from the promoted class growths, and to get the level 5 skill earlier, if the skill matters, which usually they don't, to be honest. As a special class, Thief is kind of treated like a halfway between promoted and unpromoted. They have better bases and growths than unpromoted classes, and they have 5 movement, which promoted infantry have. But all in all, they tend to have worse stats overall than all the promoted classes, at least the ones worth going into. For the most part, this means that Thief isn't a class that you want to be in. The one benefit that it has is the covert subtyping, which means that it gets double terrain bonuses. Technically, this subtyping is also shared by archers, but if you want to take full advantage of being in a void tank, you want to be able to enemy phase, and archers and snipers aren't really able to do that. Doubling terrain bonuses can get you plus 60 avoid, and with a 1-2 range weapon, you can potentially enemy phase a lot. Well, at least on normal and hard mode. On maddening mode, if enemies ever have 0 hit on a unit, they will ignore them and just move on to the next one. So it makes avoid tanking a lot less successful. If you really want to make a Thief work, you can try to thread the needle and keep them around like 5% hit so that they dodge most things and they can counter and whatnot, but I don't think all of this effort is worth it, because at the end of the day, Thief's stats are just not holding up. So even if they are dodging everything and not dying, they're usually not going to be countering for a lot of damage. And Engage gives you plenty of other strong enemy phase tools, such as Vantage Wrath or Bondage Shield. So I don't really think Thieves are worth the hassle. But let's take a look at the 2 units who start in the class anyway. Yunaka joins you in Chapter 6, and because her class is semi-promoted, I sometimes jokingly refer to her as a semi-Jagan. Her combat at the time is actually pretty powerful compared to the rest of your army, with decent speed and strength, as well as perpetual 1-2 range and the option to heavily invest in forging her daggers. Her biggest problem really is just that she's stuck in a class that is not going to hold up long term, and she's not going to be able to class out of it for a while. Second seals don't show up until after Chapter 8, at which point many of your units are going to start promoting. If you second seal in an unpromoted class, you can only change into other unpromoted classes, but if you second seal in a promoted class, then you can change into other promoted classes. Since Thief is a halfway promoted, halfway unpromoted class, what they do is once you hit level 21, you can start second sealing into promoted classes. By the time you get second seals, however, Yunaka is going to be far from level 21, so it's hard for her to second seal into a promoted class in a reasonable time frame. And if she second seals into an unpromoted class, it feels like you've promoted her into an unpromoted class at the same time that your other units are promoting out of unpromoted classes. It just really doesn't feel productive. This is the primary reason that I'm not a fan of her long term. It just takes her way too much time to get out of the Thief class. In contrast, the other Thief, Zelkov, shows up in Chapter 11 as a level 17 Thief. His personal stats are incredibly cracked, but it's 4 long levels to get out of the Thief class, and he shows up at the same time that a lot of other very strong units are showing up as well. Simultaneous to this, you start losing deployment slots, and so it's hard to justify a unit in a bad class even with good personal stats. But this is where the other secret benefit of the covert typing comes in, and that is good emblem bonuses. specifically 20 range on Lynn's Asterstorm, and plus speed on the Byleth dances. If all you're in the market for is a filler unit anyway, you might as well use a filler unit with the covert typing. And Zelkov's gonna be just about the only one with the covert typing for free, who also has decent combat in a covert class. It's nothing phenomenal, but it is potentially enough to justify his deployment. And if during that time span he gets the 4 levels he needs to move out of Thief class, then you have yourself a potentially competent Wyvern or Warrior on your hands. All in all, I'm not a huge fan of the way that Thieves were handled in Engage, and I think it is overall a result of the increased focus on their combat, as well as a side effect of the general design philosophy that requires all units to be somewhat competent at combat. Which is a shame, because I think some of the coolest Thief interactions we had was when Intelligence Systems was willing to be experimental around them, because even if they turned out bad, that's fine. Fire Emblem's allowed to have bad units. But you know what series is also allowed to have bad units? Kaga Saga, baby. That's right, we're going over the Kaga Saga Thieves now, because Kaga did some weird shit with Thieves. In Tearing Saga, Kaga made the bold decision to make stealing chance-based. After a thief engages in combat with a foe, they have a skill plus speed percent chance to steal a random item from them. The best part is they don't even need to actually land an attack for this to be rolled. They just need to engage in combat. So theoretically, if someone chucks a javelin at your thief, they can roll the dice and end up with that javelin instead, because they can steal the equipped weapons. This is incredibly fun, although notably significantly worse from a utility perspective, since anything chance-based is worse than something guaranteed. I mean, there is a guaranteed version of this effect called Mug, but it's really bad. The way that Mug works is when you kill an enemy with a unit who has Mug, they steal all of the items on that unit's inventory, not just one. And it's not random, it's guaranteed. So this sounds like an upgrade, but there's a couple of things holding it back. First is the only unit you have with the Mug skill is pretty bad. Marahan has pretty bad bases and absolutely abysmal growths. He's also sword locked, which usually isn't a good thing, and that's true in Tearing Saga as well. However, Mug also has a hidden downside. All allies within 3 spaces will have their hit and avoid reduced by 50! Kaga wasn't messing around when it came to penalties, alright? This means that even fielding a unit with Mug is a liability. But no risk, no reward. You can use Marahan and his Mug skill to steal tons of goodies, if you're willing to deal with the consequences of having him in your army. You do later get a Mug scroll so you can assign Mug to another unit, but this also means condemning one of your better units to the fate of not being good to deploy. It's worth noting that Thieves also have Lock Touch in this game, and that's theoretically useful because several objectives involve opening chests to clear the map. But Holmes, one of the 2 lords, has Lock Touch himself, so Thieves are never necessary to progress, they're just helpful. In the sequel to Tearing Saga, Berwick Saga, Thieves got even weirder. Berwick Saga has a whole host of mechanics that take ages to explain, such as its stealth mechanic, its wound and capture mechanic, the way its critical hits work, and Thieves interact with almost all of these. Additionally, Kaga brought back the chance-based stealing from Tearing Saga and the activation-based stealing from Thracia, and gave you 1 thief with each. But perhaps most interesting to me is that Berwick Saga has a mounted playable thief, something that Fire Emblem has never had. Cezanne has a special promotion based on a side quest that is a little bit too complicated to get into, but when she does, she becomes a mounted thief with a personal mount, because yeah, mounts are something you equip as well. It's complicated. This means she can open gates and then canto to safety, which is nice. And one of the main reasons that I wish Fire Emblem would experiment with mounted thieves is canto on a utility unit is cool. Then again, mainline Fire Emblem has sort of shied away from utility unit thieves. Personally, I think that if we're going to continue to have the Thief class, then it should be put into more of a utility role. Personally, I think the ideal model would be either Thracia or Tellius Thieves, but I think that if designers are going to go that route, they need to make a conscious choice to include stealables, that way players are rewarded for deploying their thieves. I also think that the way thieves gain experience should be adjusted. I mentioned this earlier, but I think more expensive items should yield more experience, similar to how killing stronger foes gives you more experience if you're a combat unit. After all, the most expensive items are usually the hardest ones to steal, so you should reward thieves and in turn players for being able to do this. Additionally, I think opening doors and chests should grant at least some amount of experience. As far as progression is concerned, I think Thieves should have a promoted class that leans into their utility role, giving them access to skills like Pass and Shade to allow them to better weave their way through the battlefield without facing danger. Alternatively, if you do want to make Thieves competent at combat, I think Engage and Fates' approach to adding debuffs or poison is a good way to go. However, knives and hidden weapons are way too strong in those games. I think their might should be lowered by quite a lot. Perhaps just adding additional debuffs for higher ranks. Maybe the iron, steel, and silver all have the same might, but apply bigger debuffs. But that's just me theory crafting a dream scenario. How would you design Thieves in the next Fire Emblem game? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious, because I think this class is fascinating, and I feel like Intelligent Systems hasn't fully explored the different avenues we could take for a thief class. And hey, while you're down there, if you're a fan of theft, go ahead and steal the like button and perhaps the subscribe one too. And if you're looking for somewhere to stash your ill-gotten gains, my Patreon link is below, which is a good segue for me to thank my patrons. Thank you to all of my patrons, which includes Gameboo, Fyrant, Cordelia Frey, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Seraphew58, Reflect, Robin Cars the Drive, Marlon McLean, Storm, Jamie Collins, Marin Karen, Thick Molder, Danielle Kalaskis, Jagan is an Est, Julia Kyoto, Arvis, Witchy, Tailored Muffin, George Granville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Controlled Ages, Joanna the Wrench Witch, Juniper Jungbi, Ginger, Belle Wenska, and Autumn Kelsey. I appreciate your continuous support. If you are interested in joining these fine fellows, there is the link below as I mentioned, but please only do so if you can comfortably afford it. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem content. Regardless, have a wonderful day, and remember, stealing is ethical, but only in Fire Emblem. Wink. For legal purposes, I did not just wink.